get blurred constantly, from the way we dress to the way we speak to how we interact to how we bury. Literally from birth to death, we are almost inundated with all these different rules and regulations. So before it gets overwhelming, and it can literally just make you continuously anxious, for me it's a question of stepping back and just being logical and thinking with common sense, because common sense, when it prevails, usually doesn't lead to such horrible outcomes.
But do you feel, though, that within the Muslim community as feminists, if we're going to call ourselves that we pick and choose what we consider, what we choose to look at? Like, as an example, now I'm not very versed within my faith, and I will put my hand up and say that, so I don't know every text, and definitely wouldn't say that I'm a scholar in any way or form. But when I was at my friend's house last night talking about Islam and feminism, he scoffed. Pah! Feminism and Islam together. It's ridiculous. And what he's told me, and he pulled out his little, Google, all right, I'm just pulled out his phone. He was showing me the verse about having virgins waiting for men in heaven within Islamic text, and I didn't really have a response to that. I was like, oh, but women are treated equally. Faith, I swear.
I've heard that verse thrown around as well, and to the best of my knowledge, it's not an actual verse or injunction. If you can correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly in terms of what Islam mandates on that issue, it's not black and white. It's not about endorsing these gross patriarchal, misogynistic outcomes. I mean, that's a very, very flawed justification for anything, and it needs to be. That's not my understanding of Islam, and that's not how I was raised. It's not what I've learned.
And as Mabalis, who I already mentioned, has addressed those types of interpretations or translations. And, one thing with people sort of Google and come up with a questionable verse, I would say I'm not sure who the translator is on that.
Yeah, you can pick and choose passages from Bibles, etc. Yeah. Can I just say on that point, I did a talk recently at a school, and it was on the Constitution and a Bill of Rights, so it was a very generic topic. But I was questioned by these Year 12 boys at this private school who came up to me and said, "You're a Muslim woman?" I said, "Yes." They go, Your religion is very oppressive. And I said, well, no, wow, why would you say that? They go, well, if you think contrary to that, you're just part of the oppressed apparatus. And clearly, if you can't see that Islam is demeaning to women, you're just being ignorant. And so they were basically explaining my religion to me and explaining mansplaining, exactly, Islam to me. And I'm really tired of people trying to enforce their belief of what they consider my experience of Islam to be. It's really as simple as that. So if I don't feel oppressed, except by these conversations, then in fact the idea of Islam's oppression becomes this obsession that others want to hang on to because they're not comfortable with it. They're aggrieved by the fact that I'm quite comfortable in my skin, in my scarf, in my identity, and that is a cause of contention for them. So I remain steadfast in that, which is not staying in my lane according to them, because according to people who take great issue with my agency in being a Muslim woman, this is not consistent with their stereotype of who I am. And I think this is like a pivot point, I think, in the conversation about Islam in the West, Islam and feminism, and how Muslim women need to be negotiated. I'm very, 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 very determined and adamant about sticking to my ground and not jumping out of my lane because it suits somebody else.
I'm gonna pick up on what Bianca and both of you were talking about and Shakira, about the translations of verses and the misogynistic verses in the Quran, and there are very mainstream interpretations of verses that then do kind of, I think, put women in this framework of a very patriarchal and misogynistic interpretation. Like the verse that you say, there are also alternatives that have been presented by feminist scholars, and if you're interested in pursuing that further, looking at the work of Amina Mudud or Fatma Mernisi or Asma Barlas is a great place to start. Now, how do we get those alternative interpretations into the mainstream? And how do we kind of start to challenge these ideas about, women having to be in a different room in the mosque, taking a different door, as long as we have a very kind of male-heavy leadership? I mean, how do we then challenge our position to be able to get female leaders and potentially have female imams and female mosques? I mean, all of these things are open to us as Muslims, but the doors seem quite heavily shut and guarded by the males in leadership positions. So where do we need to go from here to start to address these things as Muslim feminists?
Okay, wow. Okay, I'll start. I think generational change is key to that as well. A lot of that is inherited baggage, and it does take sometimes 1 and 2 generations post-settlement for communities to get to the point where they can now stop focusing on, just getting jobs and building mosques and building schools and having halal butchers, and they can start focusing on the future and identity and belonging and what it means, and negotiating that new space of being a Muslim in 2018, okay? So I think that does take some time, A. Secondly, I think organisations like Muslim Collective, I mean, they're a living and breathing example of what happens when individuals with progressive thought seek solidarity and start having those often tricky conversations. And you need a place for that. You need a space to do that, absolutely. So I think this is a really good starting point to do it. And I'm, inshallah, I'm very confident it's not the end of the conversation, but the start of it. So where that goes from this point, hopefully the numbers will expand and the thinking capital will expand and the outcomes will emanate from that. So I'm optimistic, but I don't actually have the blueprint.
Shakira, do you want to give us a blueprint?
Yeah, I'm just telling you, so gender segregation has worked in interesting ways here, because on one level it can exclude women and mean that, by definition we're not in these. On the other hand, it's provided women, and Layla Ahmed, the Egyptian academic, has written about this, that it's provided a space where women develop their own Islam in those gender segregated areas where they've been confined or, not out of, by patriarchy, by men who didn't want them in their space, but in that female-only space, they had their own religious understanding, which just didn't take the interpretation, the masculine interpretation that was being, said in that every Friday was not what it was based on, and it was other senior women that they were looking towards. And and that still exists, but for Muslim communities in the West, there's a question of resources as well, because it's hard to have those and those designated spaces where women are, I mean, in Muslim majority countries as well too, but here's, sisters, well, we would absolutely love to have more space for you, but we don't have the budget and we've got to store all that furniture somewhere anyway. Which, and they're not making that up, that's true. Where are we going to put the chairs? If you want the sisters to have a decent amount of room. And we cannot possibly, and if we get to intersectionality, and disability is a lived one of mine because of multiple sclerosis, and access to the female space, which is often up the stairs, you have to go down to the basement to do wudu, to wash, and then up again, and then up another lot of, or 2 lots of stairs even to the female prayer space. And I can't manage it, and I'm sure all these other elderly women can't manage it, and I don't know why. You don't have to be feminist to kind of, sort of think that your mum or your grandma might not be able to do that anymore. Can we not have old-fashioned, I thought that the upside of patriarchy was meant to be male chivalry, but there's not a lot of it to be found.
Yeah.
We're gonna. Do you wanna say something quickly? Because we're gonna go to one last question and then.
Yeah,
go to
sure. I just wanted to say that it's like how you change it within such a closed religion, traditional faith like Islam. I think it's forever changing now. It's becoming more fluid. The question about power and control is that men who aren't going to necessarily give up their spaces very easily. So how do you create, permanent changes that you empower women on the ground, which is what you were saying. You educate, you have these conversations. I mean, I was only listening to a podcast the other week. There are still 2 women a week being murdered because of domestic violence. That's a week in Australia. So, how we empower women has to go across faith, race, all spectrums of life, because at the moment women need to take ownership of their own lives within their own relationships, and hopefully that will progress into in places of leadership as well.
Oh God, and a very disproportionate number of Muslim women among them, and very disproportionate number of South Asian women as well, from Hindu backgrounds too. It's troubling, but it's to do with migration and settlement and anyhow.
What do we do now with this younger generation of Muslim women that are coming to the fore? How has your interaction with them, I suppose my question is, what's your perception of where they stand when it comes to feminism and women's rights issues? So I'm talking about, the 18-year-old, 19-year-old Muslim women. Is there a revival of a feminist spirit, or is there an increased conservatism? I mean, are we moving forward here, or do you have a sense of where they're at? And what kind of advice would you have for them today?
Oh, wow. I'm just trying to remember back to when I was 18 and 19. It's really hard. But I think feminism, as I understood it back then, was really through a very, Anglo-Celtic, white, middle-class, privileged lens. That's what feminism was. It was a bastion of something that I really didn't fit into, because there was no way that I belonged in that conversation, because I didn't look like them, and I didn't represent the movement that was about elevating people that looked like them. Fast forward to that now, and I think the fact that we even can very comfortably use words like intersectional discrimination and intersectional feminism in conversations means that the needle has shifted, and it is more inclusive. That said, who's actually running the show and making change? I don't know if that has shifted reins, if it is still the establishment, and some days it feels like it certainly is the same old. Other times, when I have conversations with the young emerging feminists and leaders of tomorrow, or young women leaders, they will articulate very strongly either way that they are feminists or they are not. And I think the confidence with which they come to that decision is enough for me, because it shows me that they have confidence and they're self-assured. Now, I see that as feminism, and some don't see that as feminism. They say that that's just who I am. I don't want a label. That's also fine. As long as there's a sense of self-assuredness and confidence that they're not being appropriated or being exploited by the system, by